Our speaker this evening is Simon Duffy, philosopher and activist, director of the Centre for Welfare Reform, and one of the co-founders of the Universal Basic Income Lab, Sheffield. Well-established figure in the debates on citizenship, disability rights, and basic income. And he has promised me it's going to be provocative, so it's going to be a good debate. Simon will have 30 to 40 minutes, and you're welcome to use the chat on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions or comment on what he's saying. He will go non-stop for his allocated time, and then afterwards, the discussion hosted by Ian Bache, the other co-director of QUIB. And he'll be using, or he may be using, some of the chats that you contribute to. So I hope you enjoy. So with this, I would like to hand over to our. Oh, and I also see that we have this. I should have said we have 180 people who express an interest to join, and in the chat box we've got somebody saying hi from South Africa. So this is great. The pandemic wasn't great, but the webinar is allowing us to host events that can be attended from anywhere in the world, as long as you don't mind being up at UK summertime. So I'll hand over to Simon. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Aki, and a big thank you to the Centre for Wellbeing in Public Policy, the Festival of Debate, of course, a brilliant festival in Sheffield, and the Sheffield Health and Wellbeing Board, who've helped sponsor this strand of the Festival of Debate. The picture you can see is a picture of Sheffield. Sheffield doesn't look like that these days, really, for those of you who are not Sheffielders. But it's a city, this is a picture from its kind of industrial past. Sheffield is famous for inventing stainless steel, and it's a city that many of us love. I was looking forward to walking over the couple of hills that I'd have to cross to come to deliver the lecture tonight, but it's fantastic that we can give this talk using this technology and that we can speak to such a wide audience around the world. Aki said a little bit about me, but I suppose one of the strange things about my background is this peculiar mixture of being my doctorate is in philosophy, but a lot of my work has been very much about changing social policy and working alongside people with disabilities in particular to try and shift power and control to people and families. And 11 years ago, I set up the Centre for Welfare Reform as an independent think tank in Sheffield. And one of the things that, as well as being advocates of basic income, what I found myself increasingly having to do was to try and make the case against current UK government's conception of welfare reform. So when I talk about welfare reform, I pretty much mean the opposite of what the UK government means by welfare reform. We have suffered in the UK from over a decade now of extreme austerity measures, cutting public expenditure and particularly targeting disabled people and people in poverty. That in a way informs my understanding of many of the issues we're going to be talking about. I was fortunate enough, actually it was the first festival debate back in 2015 where I was asked to speak, and I talked about basic income as one of the possibly anti-austerity ideas that we should be embracing, and that eventually, through working with Opus Independents, Mark Bryan from the University of Sheffield, Jason Lehman from the Equality Trust, led to the creation of UBI Lab Sheffield and the UBI Lab Network, and there are now, I think, 16 UBI labs, not just in England but also in other parts of the world. So the movement of promoting basic income is growing in a really exciting way. When you give a talk, you have to tell people what you're going to talk about. I wanted to talk about basic income and the idea of the good life, which of course is another way of talking about well-being. But in particular, I wanted to talk about the place of work in our understanding of the good life. So my hypothesis, written down here, is establishing a system of basic income is an important step in helping us become a community that cares for our common welfare, and in particular, it will help us find the true meaning of work and its place within the good life. Now, so one of the things I'm not really going to talk about, although it is an important issue, is the impact that basic income will have, positively or negatively, on the number of people in paid work. I was remembering in preparation for this talk a few months ago, in fact it was before the general election, the Labour Party had embraced the possibility of piloting basic income, and there was a news item and I was invited very hurriedly to appear on BBC Politics. I was just a little picture on a screen, and in the studio was a Tory MEP who was saying very confidently, of course, oh, well, they just piloted basic income in Finland and it failed, didn't it? And by fail, he meant it had led to fewer people being in work. I mean, what is curious about that is that he ignored all the positive findings of increased well-being and increased mental health. But as we discovered a couple of months ago, the full results from Finland showed also that he was wrong, because it actually led to more people being in paid work. So basic income often does seem to have this impact of improving the path into paid work, but it's not actually the issue that I want to tackle. When you talk about, so I want to talk about basic income, I want to talk about work, and I want to talk about well-being. And I was reminded also of my friend Katja, who's a Finnish academic who was visiting the UK, and she asked me when we were on a trip, why is everybody so negative about welfare in this country? In Finnish, the word just means well-being. And I think this is a very interesting issue. I thought, well, actually, it's interesting that I come from the Centre for Welfare Reform, and I'm speaking, and I'm very grateful for the invitation, at an event hosted by the Centre for Wellbeing in Public Policy. And I thought, those two things actually mean the same thing, don't they? It's interesting. They mean the thing in one sense, but clearly welfare and well-being have drifted apart in the UK, and where welfare is a stigmatized concept, well-being is I couldn't think of a better word, but it's a sexy concept. It's one that you're seeing adopted quite a lot, just as welfare is being avoided or being associated with people in poverty in particular. Well-being is being associated with health, which is something also that we're very positive about. Welfare is seen as something that's for other people, for them in some vague way. Well-being is actually seen as something we should all be caring about. It's a kind of aspirational concept, but also universal. Welfare is seen as meeting needs, whereas I think well-being is seen much more as being something that you positively improve. But when you push, what do these concepts mean? They really mean the same thing. Welfare really just means well-being, and well-being really means welfare. And what we have here is, yes, a problem that some people think is a linguistic problem. So I was talking a few years ago now, I would talk on welfare reform and austerity to the bishops of the north of England, and the Archbishop of York said, oh, it's a real problem, this, isn't it? I think it was a big mistake of William Temple. William Temple was the Archbishop of York in the 1930s, who actually coined the term the welfare state. And the Archbishop said, well, I think that was a mistake, because we're associating the welfare state with this problematic concept, welfare. I think that's got the causality completely wrong. What's going on is that welfare has become an increasingly stigmatized concept, and it's particularly associated with the benefit system. And that's one of the major reasons why many of us back basic income. We want a universal system like the NHS, which is associated with universal value with all of us. And it's the othering effect of the benefit system, the fact that benefits are seen as a kind of technical fix for other people's needs, that for the them, which has allowed welfare and well-being to take on the appearance of having two different meanings. This is my very simplified definition of universal basic income. Universal basic income is a concept that, in a sense, that there have been interesting pilots. There are partial universal basic incomes in place, which are associated with very many good outcomes. But it's been subject to lots of academic definition, even despite the fact that in some sense, empirically, there's not a lot of it around, or whatever there is of it around is somewhat partial. But I think this simplified definition, I hope, gets to the heart of what those of us who support basic income are trying to achieve. So the first part of it is it's a regular cash payment. So universal basic income is definitely about cash. It's definitely saying it's better for people that they can buy their own food, they can buy their own clothes, they can spend money in ways that make sense to them. We don't want to be living in a world of a kind of permanent food banks. Of course, this is an indication, isn't it, of the UK's failure to even deliver most minimal level of social security, that we have 5,000 food banks in the United Kingdom now, and food bank usage doubled during the COVID crisis. So we're not even reaching stage 1 in the UK. Beyond just being cash, the second component is that it's enough to live on with dignity. It's a minimum income, a decent minimum income. And clearly universal credit doesn't meet that level, otherwise there wouldn't be people going to food banks, and the government wouldn't have had to increase the level of the universal credit as an emergency measure as part of the COVID crisis. The third, more controversial element of universal basic income is that it's universal. Universal means there's no means testing. It means that the rich get it as well as the poor. Or another way of looking at it is the means testing is only in the tax system. We don't have a kind of double means testing system where we also means test the poor. Because the paradox of means testing, which sounds good, government always talks about it as targeting, is that what it really means is the poor pay higher marginal tax rates on their early earnings than the better off. So basic income gets rid of that. The other really radical thing about basic income that gets much less attention than the universality is that it's for individuals. And what it does is it undermines the concept of the breadwinner, or the head of the household. It's hugely beneficial, and the data supports this, for women in particular, both enabling people to be more economically independent and to avoid domestic abuse. So a very important component. And actually, when you look at the numbers, that's the biggest redistributional impact, is that basic income redistributes resources to people who are currently working but who are not paid, and that's often carers and other people. But the one I really want to talk about is the unconditionality of universal basic income. Unconditionality means you get it even whatever you do, whether you seek work or whether you don't seek work, or however you define work. There is no sanctions, the money isn't taken off you, there's no punishments. That's what I'm going to talk about. And the reason I want to talk about that is because actually, in a strange kind of way, I think that's probably where a lot of the most deeply seated resistance to universal basic income comes from when you do polling. This is from a report that we haven't published yet. We did some polling of people, not about basic income, but about some of the underlying questions. And this question you can see here: should the government check that people are looking for work? Now, huge majority of people actually ticked the pro-universal benefit, pro-UBI option. So people have a right to benefits and should be free to make their own decisions. But just over a quarter said, no, I'm not sure. Maybe some people need to be controlled for their own good. And 13% said, no, people who get benefits need to be managed and sanctioned if they break the rules. And given the nature of this survey report, I think if we did different sampling, we'd find that number growing as well. So this was the most anti-UBI finding in our research, and that's why I wanted to talk about the case for abandoning conditionality. The third concept, not just UBI and welfare, is of course work, and work is a really interesting concept that we don't talk about very much. Being in paid work has become almost the central virtue of modern life. What do you do equates to what is your job, what is it other people need to do, and it becomes how we evaluate ourselves. Of course, this is not just in the right. I mean, Karl Marx really proposed that not work but labour was the kind of engine for social reform, and many on the left are still very committed to the notion that this is the means by which the world transforms itself. But of course, clearly, work, unemployment, highly political concepts. The poster up in the top right-hand corner is not from the austerity regime of the last 10 years. This was a poster, part of a campaign set up by Gordon Brown, targeting benefit thieves. And this process of assuming that people in poverty and people on benefits are objects of suspicion and that we need to target them and check that they're not doing the wrong thing is an idea that's actually got a lot worse in the last 20 years. As you can see from the DWP's policy statement, its number one priority is not to stop people being poor, but to make sure that people get into work. And then we see again and again these statements about how work is the pathway out of poverty, despite 40 years of growing poverty and growing inequality. In the background, you can see from the gates of Dachau, Arbeit macht frei, the work makes us free. This is maybe a bleak and extreme thing to say, but concepts like work are very plastic. They're very bendable. They're things that can be distorted and misused. And you've got to ask yourself, who is benefiting from this kind of worshipping of the concept of paid work? So that's the question I really want to examine. Is work even a good thing to begin with? It's interesting that work certainly was not always valued as positively as we value it today. In Latin, work, business, occupation is negotium, the opposite of free time, leisure and ease, also associated with time to think and create. And a negotiator, someone who's carrying on business, is a banker or a banker. So in the classical period, actually being free of work was seen as a condition of citizenship, of philosophy, of thought. That's what you aspired to be. If you weren't free, then you were busy. So it's very curious how that notion of work is not being respected. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her fascinating book, The Human Condition, talks about how this original notion in the classical period of action and thought we've lost sight of, and instead this work and then later on labour came to dominate our idea of the good life. But she argues very strongly that that's a loss. It's a loss of perspective on what it means to be a full human being. The other thing, of course, is that this idea of making people work doesn't work very well. The government talks about work activation. But what does work activation mean? Well, it means if you don't do what we say, we will punish you. Sanctions, again, is a kind of just another word for punishment. And if you do what we say, we will send you to things like the work programme. The slides here show data from a report by one of our fellows, Catherine Hale, where she was looking at something called the Work-Related Activities Group and their experience of the work programme. You can see, for instance, that in the sample, most people, by a huge extent, felt that actually after experiencing the work programme, they were less confident about going to work than before they entered it. These kind of programmes assume the right of the state to bureaucratically manage people, and they assume the competence of the state to do so. But the evidence is that the state is not competent in these things and ends up actually doing harm. The other really interesting thing, again, people are very aware, I think, that, well, there's work and then there's good work, if that makes sense, that, you know, that work isn't always good for you. And we know that because actually work is often a precursor of mental illness. One of our other fellows, Anna-Karin Fager-Lind-Stahl, who has a doctorate in occupational health, has written a couple of really interesting papers looking at what are the associated factors with good health and well-being and work conditions. And she, as you can see on the image here, the things that help you flourish in work are a good social circle, friends, support, lots of freedom, decision latitude. The things that are really challenging are lots of pressure, effort, job insecurity, a sense of injustice in the workplace. But if you think about that, as Anna-Karin argues, well, then it isn't work that's good for you. It's these prior things. It's friendship, it's meaning, it's having friends, it's doing things that are meaningful to you, it's having security. In fact, if you stop just thinking about being at work and think about the situation where you're not at work, which is largely when you're reliant on benefits, then these same principles hold. If you want to see people flourish, then create a system with high level of security. Well, that's what basic income offers. If you want to see people suffer, then create the kind of systems we've seen in the United Kingdom, like Unit of Credit, where we've seen a huge increase in mental illness associated with the benefits. We've seen increase in suicides and the use of tranquilizers. All of these government policies are driving poorer mental health. So they don't sit well with this notion that work is good for you. No, what's good for you is meaning, what's good for you is freedom, what's good for you is security. Work isn't doing much work here. The other really interesting confusion in the way we talk about work is that we often slip from talking about work, paid work, and employment. Employment is a kind of legal relationship, which actually goes back to the master-servant relationship or even the master-slave relationship. I think it's interesting to think about if Aristotle turned up today in 21st century Britain and was trying to make sense of what everybody was doing and who they were working for and who is free and who is not free, I think he would certainly conclude that the slaves of modern Britain are much better paid generally than the slaves of ancient Athens, but I think he would probably think that most of us are really some form of slave in the technical sense of the master-servant relationship, which is that we have to do what we are told to do. Now, I know that in an academic context, the employee has, relatively speaking, lots more freedom, but this is the fundamental relationship that we seem to be celebrating when we say, isn't it great lots of people are employed? We've confused employed, I think, with isn't it great lots of people have secure incomes or lots of people have meaningful lives, but being employed doesn't imply either of those two things. A few years ago, I started to think a little bit more about this, and it struck me that one of the ways you could start to perhaps reimagine what work really meant is imprinted in the days of the week. And this may seem a little bit fanciful, but the days of the week also represent some very deep wisdom because they go back to actually the 7 planets, and this dominated thinking in the classical period and in the medieval period. If you think about the days of the week, you have this kind of pattern, which is that I think Monday is associated with the moon, and the moon is associated with creativity. Creativity is work, art is work, music is work, all the things we do to bring about beauty in the world and meaning in the world are in a sense a form of work. Often totally unpaid, but nevertheless work. Tuesday is really about service. It's about serving the community. It's the sacrifice we make to look after the community in extremis in the form of fighting for our community and defending our community, or it's the work we do in our community to take care of each other, volunteering. All of these things are a form of service, and all of these things are work and usually are unpaid. Wednesday, Woden's Day, Mercury Day in French, poorly pronounced, apologies, is Mercury was about exchange. Woden that's about business, that's about money, that's about the markets, and that is an aspect of work too. That we do things for money, we do sell things, we do sell our time, we do sell the products we grow. Thursday, jeudi is about actually growing, building, making. That sense, Thor was the farmer's god. Friday, Freya's day, day of love. It's the day of family. It's the day of it's taking care of each other. Saturday is associated with Saturn. Another part of life which we certainly tend to avoid calling work is enjoying ourselves, something which we shouldn't be frightened of celebrating as being part of the good life. And Sunday is the day of rest or praise or meditation or thought. I just think, you know, this may seem fanciful or overly poetic and not very scientific, but it is curious how we've almost reduced our sense of what life's about to being employed or unemployed or in work, not in work. When I think the older wisdom is that really life is about doing all of these things and finding balance. And we need to, I think, in our theories of well-being, start to develop a much broader sense of what's important in life. And this then takes us back, I think, to the concept of well-being. I think that we would be much better listening to people like Aristotle's thinking about well-being. What is Aristotle saying 2,400 years ago? He's saying that well-being is about self-development, about flourishing, about making the most of yourself, being the best that you can be, but in harmony with virtue. So in a society which supports each other and where people are taking care of each other, I think is another way of looking at that. Because virtue is about how we live together so that everybody can flourish. In my work, I've talked about citizenship, an image of this, and in the Greek tradition, citizenship was the kind of paradigmatic state of a good life lived well, to be a citizen. And that means living a life of meaning, having freedom, having enough money to be independent, having a home of your own, getting assistance, contributing to the life of the community, having love and relationships. I think one of the things that is a helpful discipline is to just ask yourself what you want for those you love. If you think about what you want for yourself, obviously we're all a bit tempted by things like, oh, I'd love to earn more money than I do. I'd love to have more status than I do. I'd love to have more power than I do. Those kind of three classic temptations are always there for each one of us. But actually, if you say, well, if you think about your child or somebody you love, do you want them to be richer and richer? Do you want them to be more and more powerful? Do you want them to be more and more famous? You'd go, oh, no, that's silly, isn't it? That's not what a good life's about. What you'd want is that they could live a full life. What you'd want is that they can make the best of their own unique gifts. So I think thinking about what we want for those of is a really good way of trying to define what we mean by well-being. And once you do that, I think the concept of work starts, if not disappearing, it suddenly looks at a very different place. Finally, this is my seventh argument and final one, is that this system really isn't working. The notion that our basic economic security must rely only on us being in relationships of paid employment to others is actually kind of undermining the world itself. I love this fact from Rutger Bregman's brilliant book, Utopia for Realists. I'd recommend it if you're interested in universal basic income and you haven't read much about it. That's a great place to start. But just what he said, that if you go back to 1300 in France and you look at all the holidays that are celebrated in France and all the time off, then the medieval peasant was working for 6 months of the year and not working for the other 6 months of the year. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that with all the technology we have, that seems like a fantasy. But if we're going to move away from this kind of mad economy where government believes any economic activity, however bad for the planet, is somehow good, and you say, why is it good? It's good because it's providing wages. It's good. It's providing economic security. What basic income says is, no, this is the wrong approach. What we've got to do is provide the security first, and then we work out what it is that we need to do, given that we're going to commit each other to be secure. So this is why I think basic income is such an attractive concept and helps us rethink work. It gives us the moment, it gives us a chance to really think about what's important. It strips away these harmful punishments and this paternalistic attitude from the state that is completely damaging and without good foundation. It allows us to move from paid work that's bad for us to focus on the paid work that's good for us. It gives us the freedom possibly to escape employment and to move to economic relationships which are much more independent and cooperative. It actually starts respecting the work of love, the work of service, creativity, all the good things that we need in life, many of which simply don't fit into the model of paid work that we're currently using. It allows us to think about the real purpose of life and to focus on, with sufficient security, actually how do we make the best of ourselves. And finally, it allows us to create a model of well-being, an economic model, which is actually in harmony with the needs of the planet as well as the needs of our own nature. So my final slide really is just to invite people who have not heard of UBI Lab Network or have not heard about much about basic income to get in touch. The UBI Lab Network is now, operating around the world, but I like made in Sheffield, like the stainless steel knives that are also circulated around the world. It's a great resource, and it's a great example of what happens when people come together to try and work cooperatively to achieve something good, not because anybody's paying us, but just because we think this is the way to a world of well-being. Thank you. I've finished.
Thank you, Simon. I'd like to invite Ian to put his microphone on, please, and his camera on, please.
I should be there now. Can you hear me, Aki?
Yes, I can hear you, and in a minute, yes, we can see you. So,
thanks very much, Simon. I've got a few questions from the audience and one or two of my own, and I think there's connecting themes. So what I might do, if I may, is read out 3 questions that came from the audience that I think connect very closely, and let you kind of ponder as I go through them.
Okay.
So Robert Smith asked, how do you objectively define enough to live with dignity?
Yeah.
Natalie asked, what is the minimum you need to make you happy?
Yeah.
And then Murray raised a question which I think comes up in a number of criticisms of UBI, which is, are there any studies of disabled people receiving UBI and how this impacts them? Because at the moment we have the PIP benefit, which is seen as imperfect, but does at least address the issue that there are extra costs to being disabled. So this speaks to, I think all of those speak to this kind of central question about how do you set the basic income to address the point that different people need different amounts to function effectively, because different housing costs, disabilities, childcare, and so on.
Yes, good. Okay, great questions. I think the first two I'm going to link together a wee bit, and then talk about the disability issue in a bit more detail. But yeah, so how do we set that minimum level, and what is the minimum for happiness? Interestingly, I'm not an expert on this. I remember this just from a lecture, actually, that there is data around. I think there are happiness economists, aren't there, who have done this. I think the figure, this is going back a few years ago, but the figure that was always cited was that at about $10,000 by the international level of the dollar then, I don't know what that would be today, adding more money to your life doesn't increase your happiness. So there is at least an empirical argument you can have here, and I think it's probably it's clearly open to debate, but it is interesting, I think, that you can actually just study some of this. You can actually find out what levels of money make a big difference to people's life, and at what point money stops making a difference in life. So I don't have a strong view on what the right answer is in that sense, but it's not a purely philosophical question. It's actually, I think, at some level, a empirical question. Dignity, of course, is one of the key words here. So people may say, well, we can give you this amount of money, but you'll survive on it. But will you survive with dignity? What does dignity mean? In my work, the concept of citizenship, in a sense, is trying to define dignity in a fairly empirical way. How do you live a life of dignity? Well, you need to be doing things that are meaningful to you. Actually, doing something that isn't meaningful to you, even for a lot of money, actually erodes your dignity. Dignity isn't all about money. It's about the life you lead and the way you lead it and how you're perceived by others. If you could have a lot of money, but you don't have a lot of freedom, and that also damages your dignity. So dignity I would argue, is also a kind of empirical concept. It's a real part of the world. We can see people's dignity being diminished when we put people into institutions, when we take control over their lives, when we label them as the poor or a benefit recipient. All of this actually eats away at people's dignity. For me, a lot of what drove me to be interested in basic income was trying to work out what would be the most dignified way of helping people have enough money to live on. So basic income, in a sense, is designed to promote dignity, but actually the question of how much money that will be is always going to be a political question, isn't it? So let's imagine we had a basic income in the United Kingdom or any country today. People will be arguing about it, won't they? In the same way they argue about how much money should be in the NHS. The big difference between a basic income and a benefit in this regard is that when we're arguing about the case for increasing the basic income or reducing the basic income, we're arguing about something that's an entitlement for all of us. Currently, when we're arguing about benefit levels, most people actually don't think about benefits even when they're receiving them. Like pensions is basically a benefit that people forget is a benefit. They think of it as some kind of different entitlement, and they think that benefits apply to some small number of people, and the people who make decisions about that are politicians, the wealthy, some think tanks. It's not a public matter. So I think that it might seem a funny way to answer the question, but it's not a technical thing I can just answer here. This is the right amount, although I think there's lots of empirical discussion we can have about it. It's fundamentally going to be a political thing. It's something we've all got a stake in resolving. That's the disability question. One of the things that it's without a doubt, particularly in the United Kingdom, disabled people are worried about the case for basic income. They imagine that basic income means removing all the additions in the benefit system. It doesn't. At least nobody in the basic income movement that I know believes that. Of course, we are currently have one of the most extreme right-wing governments in the world, so it's very hard not to fear that any change will be implemented badly. We've been arguing for what we call basic income plus. So basic income provides the amount that everybody needs, and then plus describes the extra elements. So personal independence payments, what used to be disability living allowance, is a good example of a reasonably easy to define non-means tested benefit. So I would imagine, and we've written about this, that this is the kind of thing that will continue as an additional payment on top of the basic income. Other benefits that are for disability, like employment support allowance, what we would be doing is removing the sanctions, removing the means testing, removing the household dependency. So really improving the plus, making it work much better for disabled people. But I don't want to be naive about this. It's not the definition that's going to save people. It's politics, it's power, it's about how we argue for these things in the real world. And it's certainly very damaging to the basic income movement that it hasn't managed to find common cause yet with the disability movement, because disabled people are really one of the largest groups of people whose incomes are very linked to the benefit system. So that is a challenge, I've got to admit.
Thanks very much, Simon. Just picking up more as I'm listening to you. So if I don't come back to you, that's part of the explanation. A couple of linked questions, again, one from Alex Murray, one from Clara Bukhara. And Clara asks, how does UBI address the problems created by capitalism separate from bad work, such as the environment? And Alex asks, is this just a sticking plaster? Is this something that's just going to help keep capitalism going?
Well, I suppose the question, I'd flip that round and say, well, let's imagine we defeat capitalism. What would that look like? Because I think it would look like having a basic income plus some other good things. I mean, it's interesting to read the Communist Manifesto. I mean, much of what's in the Communist Manifesto, we've made a half stab at doing. I mean, so when people say things like defeating capitalism, then which I'm all for, to be honest, I'm not sure that's the same as how would food be organised in this post-capitalist society? A giant food bank? Is that what we're arguing for? I mean, in Sheffield, we have some great organic farmers who've started to provide great milk, our cow Molly, they're called. Now, that movement for high quality milk, organic milk, started because citizens of Sheffield started to choose that milk over what had been provided by the other milk providers. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure that I see the logic, really. Is it a sticking plaster? Is the NHS a sticking plaster? Yes, in a way it is. Because maybe there would have been a revolution if we hadn't got a National Health Service. But we want the NHS, don't we? So I'm not quite sure. Yeah, the sticking plaster argument makes it seem pejorative. To trying to do is replace broken capitalist systems with better human systems, and basic income would be just one of those better human systems. And I think that is why it's also going to be really helpful for dealing with the huge problems we have with the planet. If you want to get people out of the broken economic system we have now, where people are so fearful they will do pointless work or work that's even bad for the planet, you need to provide people with security. So it's actually the foundation for changing our attitude to the world and changing the way in which we start to make our economy work. If we say to each other, because this is really what basic income means, what we're saying to each other is, you know what, we're going to take care of each other no matter what. It's a bit like, in a crappy way, what the government did with the COVID crisis. It said, we better throw money at all of these people and all of those things, because if we don't, the whole thing will collapse. Well, basic income is a kind of organised way of saying, actually, that's the commitment we need to do. We need to make sure that everybody's going to be okay. And now let's focus on the things that really need to work. So let's make sure the planet works. Let's take care of the soil. Let's take care of the environment. Let's take care of each other. Let's take care of the physical environment. Let's take care of the air. And we can do that because we're now not just desperate to have any job at any price.
Right, thank you. I had a look at the government's response to this idea today while I was preparing for this. And a cabinet minister is on record as saying an affordable basic income would be inadequate. A basic income that's adequate for all would be unaffordable. That seems to be a central concern. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I disagree with it, but of course affordability is a critical issue. And in my view, it's all to do with tax. If you say the level of tax we currently have now cannot increase for anyone, then the level of basic income that you will have will be quite modest. That's definitely true. But if you instead say what we really want is a system of basic income which is good enough for everybody, then you're making really a case for increasing the level of tax on people. And what that does really, the basic maths of basic income are, it tends to disadvantage people who have incomes higher than the mean income, not the median income, but the mean income. So those people would expect to pay more than they currently do. And it benefits everybody below that, and it benefits everybody proportional to how low their income is. So it benefits massively people on no other income, and it benefits people with a modest income much less. But it is basically a form of redistribution from as the current UK economy is organised. It's a system of redistribution of the top 15% to the bottom 85%. But yeah, if you say, well, no, you couldn't possibly, it's a religious truth that taxes must remain at the low level they currently stand at, then yes, you're working within very significant constraints.
So just to follow up, who are the main winners and losers? Because I was looking at something by the Roundtree Foundation that had a fairly critical stance on this overall, which is a bit surprising in terms of its effects on poverty. And we're kind of saying it wouldn't necessarily have the desired effects. So who are the main winners and losers?
Well, again, I don't think the JRF have never done a proper analysis of this, but I think what their fear is that if you work within the constraints of the current tax system, what you're going to see is some benefits. Beneficiaries will include people who don't currently work, but who may have, say, a partner who's working. So say if you've got two of you in the household and one of you's taking care of the children, one's out to work earning £100,000 or a very good salary, like amazingly good salary like that, both will get the basic income, and that's obviously that won't affect poverty. So their point is that you're distributing resources not just to the wealthy, but also to other members of the household who are in a wealthy household. But again, I don't think that this any modelling that's been done shows significant benefits for. Stuart Lansley just published an article, and he's somebody who's done the detailed modelling. This show even a modest basic income actually benefits the poor. So I think that, but there's a lot of devil in the detail, depending on what constraint you assuming, really. And certainly if you assume that you're only going to redistribute a fixed pot, then you're going to see some people benefit that you might not be expecting. It's this individualization of basic income that's the thing that people often miss out on. It basically goes to everyone. So it should go to, I think, children, but it's adults where it's most controversial. It goes to adults, including adults who might have a partner in work. That's hugely beneficial for many people as well, for the reasons I explained.
Okay, thank you. Reinhard Huss has asked a couple of questions. The first question asked today. So earlier in your presentation, you were talking about the sort of stigma attached to the term welfare and welfare state. Would it be better to propose a human rights state rather than a welfare state?
I think there have been a lot of arguments about this goes back to the Archbishop point. We can now, in the situation where the word welfare is tarnished, start imagining all sorts of better words to use. I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask. I take a personal kind of my personal view is that if a word has been tarnished and misused, we're better getting hold of it and trying to use it right than throwing it in the dustbin of history. So I take the same view of the word citizenship, because the word citizenship is often associated now with just having a passport. That's the opposite of what I mean. For me, you should get a basic income if you're living in the country, whether or not you have the passport, whether or not you have the paperwork, for human rights and moral reasons. And I don't think we should abandon the word citizenship, though, just because Theresa May or somebody else has misused it. I think we need to go back in and say, no, this is what citizenship really means. And for me, it's the same with welfare and the welfare state. Yes, it has been misused. Yes, it has been associated with negative things. But somehow I think you end up reinforcing that process of stigma by just trying to move on to some new, sexier language. But that might be just my error, Ian, to be honest. It's like an existential choice I've made in my life to just kind of carry on using some of these older terms.
Well,
human rights, of course,
the term well-being is far from without its critics, I should let you know, Simon. Reinhard's second question was about universal basic services and suggests that UBS and UBI belong together and should be combined for human dignity. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes. So, I mean, of course, I completely agree with Reinhard, and it's very important to identify that some things in life are not well managed through giving people income. And the obvious example is healthcare. Actually, it's a completely poor model to use to buy your own healthcare, or even to buy insurance for healthcare. Is a very, very poor way. Anybody studying public policy knows that it has many negative impacts. So the view I take is that all public goods, health is a public good, or healthcare is a public good, income, food, housing are different kind of public goods, all things we need, have different logics. The environment has got a different logic as well. I mean, we need clean air, and we all need clean air, and it's not exactly clear that that's a service either. So we have to think differently and sensitively about the different aspects of life, and we need to organise around them. So we certainly need some things organised as effectively as a universal basic service might be a way of considering that, of thinking about that. But other things are well managed through things that people can control as individuals. The philosopher Simone Weil, I think, I love, she said, the human soul needs private property and the human soul needs public property. We need some things to be things that we all share together, but we also need some things that are just ours. And I'm not saying I can confidently delineate the border correctly every time, but I think it's a mistake to think you have to choose between those two things, and we have to be a little bit more careful in our analysis.
Okay, thank you. We've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, and so apologies to anyone whose question I've not read out, but I thought, given the context at the moment, that we should at least ask a question about the current circumstances and the pandemic, and the difference that this has made or is making to the prospects for UBI. Because on the one hand, you can see it as something that's exposed inequalities, but on the other hand, the financial issues connected to it. So what's your take on where we are and what this situation means?
I think that, you know, again, just from looking at the narrow perspective of those of us who are advocates of basic income, it has actually massively increased the exposure of the issue, and it's made people much more aware of the fragility of the basic economic system, and that actually, unless you have the state, which it did do, even this Conservative government stood in and has made extraordinary spending commitments in order to provide economic security to people. So in one sense, it's been actually a boon to the basic income movement. And it's been, and actually, it's not me, but some of my colleagues in the UBI Lab Network and others have been very much leaders in offering models. Mark Bryan from the University of Sheffield has defined models for an emergency basic income and a recovery basic income that the government could have chosen to adopt. What it chose to do instead was something else, which was it chose to subsidise employers, it chose to subsidise businesses, it chose to subsidise, actually what we're going to find at the end of the day, it's chosen to subsidise things in a way that's highly regressive. So the better off will be better off because of COVID than the poor. And that's why we've doubled the number of people in food banks. And that's that this government chose not to do the logical thing and say, let's give money to everybody. Let's ensure everybody's well-being. It said, let's save big business. Let's save the horse racing, as it turns out. It's much more important. Horses are much more important than ordinary people, I think, in the eyes of some people in government.
So where do you see in the UK, I guess this must be the final question, political leadership on this issue coming from?
Yes, well, I mean, it's very interesting. So we're going to see very shortly in Scotland, there's very likely to be a demand by the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Government to the English or the UK government asking for permission to test basic income in Scotland. So that seems very likely to happen, and it's very likely that that will be rejected. So one of the next things we'll see is a kind of constitutional crisis following the COVID crisis, which will centre upon the basic income question. I think we're seeing the Green Party has always been very supportive, of course. I think Clive Lord, who led a lot of this, is on this call. Plaid Cymru, the parties in Northern Ireland, the SNP, the Liberal Democrats are now, actually many of them are starting to talk about basic income as maybe this is a way that the Liberal Democrat Party can kind of finally free itself from its association with austerity politics. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens inside the Labour Party. Currently, they're avoiding making any strong commitments in this space. So I think what we've seen is the policy has become the obvious alternative to the disaster that is universal credit. We've moved away from a period where the only show in town was universal credit, and even the Labour Party wasn't really willing to challenge universal credit. That's no longer the case. So it's going to change political debate. But obviously we live at a point where there's a very strong Conservative government. Making people miserable is probably what their ideology boils down to these days. And so I think that universal credit is going to be something they're very committed to for a long time. And but I think that we're going to start to see people in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, particularly maybe in the north, maybe through some of the devolved authorities, start to challenge that. So this will take on, I think, a really somewhat of a regional colour in the next couple of years, my guess. And we'll also see other countries leading the way, as we started to see. Even the US created a kind of basic income model as a way of responding to the COVID crisis.
Great. Simon, I think we have to wrap up there. Can I thank you for an excellent talk? At this stage, I usually ask the audience to show their appreciation, but they've done that in their comments. And thank you to those of you that have tuned in today for this. So thanks very much, Simon, and we'll stay in touch. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.